always a great pleasure and a great honor to be here in Leuven, the same place where I had to defend my PhD thesis. And yeah, I hope you will enjoy the talk. So it's about Neoplatonic criticism of the Stoic theory of lekta. And so for me, studying the Stoic theory of lekta is a new topic. So I wrote this book on forms and concepts, and I was very much interested in the ancient notion of concept, so mainly in Plato-Aristotle, but also in Neoplatonism. And I always avoided discussing the Stoic theory of lekta, because I found it very difficult. And now I started reading a little bit the text, studying it. And yeah, I think it is a fascinating topic. And I hope I can explain a little bit of my fascination today about the lekta. So, and although the title is Neoplatonic criticism of Stoic lekta, I will use the Neoplatonic criticism only as a foil. So I will, I think, mainly talk about the lekta. Yeah, and afterwards, I hope we can discuss about these texts. So I want to start, so all of you have the handout. I want to start with the first text. That's a quote from Stephen Mann. It's a classic article on the Stoic theory of categories. And Stephen Mann writes, "The Stoic theory of categories is a crucial part of their defense of a consistently corporealist version of the Platonic inheritance. The later Platonists shared this inheritance, and their qualities and souls and forms and virtues are beings just as active as the Stoic versions. Their attacks on the Stoic doctrine of categories, on corporeal qualities, and the much vaunted pos echon are a counterattack in the defense of the Platonic belief that these beings and agents are incorporeal. So it's very much about this contrast between bodies and incorporeals. So the Stoics call the lekta incorporeals. And one text that is frequently discussed in this context is, of course, Plato's Sophists, so the famous battle between the gods, or the friends of the forms, as they are called, and the giants or materialists. And the sophist, as we will see, is also important for the Stoic theory of predication. So with this, I mean the view that logos is composed of an onoma and a rhema. So, and before I start, let me briefly explain the structure of the handout. So first, on paragraph 2, I will give the Aristotelian background of the whole discussion. So this is mainly Aristotle's on interpretation, but also his work on the categories. And then I will go on talking about the Neoplatonic criticism of the Stoic lekta. And most of this criticism we find in the Neoplatonic commentaries or on the categories or on interpretation. So, for example, we will read a passage from Ammonius' commentary on Aristotle's on interpretation. And so afterwards, I will come back to the Stoics and want to introduce some basic questions that scholars have raised in the context of discussions about lekta. And then I will, in 4.1.1, give a short characterization of lekta, and will read with you some texts about lekta. And then in paragraph 4.6, I will explain that, well, in Aristotle and in the Stoics, what we find are different epistemological frameworks. So basically different theories of signification. And this is important because, as we will see, the Neoplatonic criticism of the lekta mainly starts from, let's say, an Aristotelian or an Aristotelian Neoplatonic perspective. So I will talk in 4.62 about some fundamental differences between the Stoics and Aristotle. So basically their psychology and ontology and epistemology. And then finally, I want to raise the question, so what may have been the reason for the Stoics to introduce these strange entities called lekta? So this is more or less the structure of this talk. So you find a bibliography at the end. So it's only a selection of contributions. But what I find quite interesting is that in the last couple of years, a lot of things have been studied, have been published on the Stoic theory of lekta. So, for example, when you look at the bibliography, we have 2013 the impressive study by Michele Alexandrelli in Italian. And then we have two monographs in English, one by Ada Bronowski, so with the nice title, The Stoics on Lekta, All There Is to Say. And then most recently, we have a monograph by Vanessa de Haven, published in 2025, The Unity of Stoic Metaphysics, Everything is Something. And so there is quite an interest in the Stoic theory of lekta. Okay, so then I go back to paragraph 2, the Stoics and Aristotle. And I start with a well-known text from the first chapter of Aristotle's On Interpretation. And there Aristotle says the following: no, spoken sounds are symbols, symboli of affections, pathemata in the soul. And written marks, symbols of spoken sounds. And just as written marks are not the same for all men, neither are spoken sounds. But what these are in the first place, signs of affections of the soul, are the same for all. And what these affections are likenesses of actual things, pragmata, are also the same. These matters have been discussed in the work on the soul and do not belong to the present subject. So far Aristotle. And so this well-known text asserts that basically thoughts in the soul are likenesses of things. And so the way Aristotle describes it, so I think it is an account that holds true for different languages. So not only for the Greek language, but for all kind of languages. For he says, well, spoken and written sounds are symbols, whereas the pragmata in the affections in the soul are likenesses. So here there's this crucial difference Aristotle makes between likenesses on the one hand and symbols on the other. So the next text, 2.2, is about the question where Aristotle locates truth and falsity. And so it's a quote from the Metaphysics, and Aristotle says, for falsity and truth are not in the things, pragmata, but in thought. For the combination, symploché, and division are in thought, but not in the things. So, and why is this text important? Later we will see that the Stoics have a different view on where truth is to be located. And yeah, now I will skip the next text and we'll go to 2.4. And there Aristotle says, well, every sentence, logos, is significant, not as a tool, but as we said, by convention. But not every sentence is a statement making sentence, but only those in which there is truth and falsity. So what is important to memorize here, so for Aristotle, language is by convention, not by nature. So this is the famous discussion we find in Plato's Kratilos. And later we will see that the Stoics will argue that language is actually by nature. So we have in Aristotle a certain theory of predication we find in the categories, but also on interpretation. And the Stoic theory of predication is more or less the same as the theory we find in Aristotle. So if we look at text 2.5, so in the categories, Aristotle would say there are things, so mainly the categories, and they are said without combination. And without combination, that means so they are, how do you say, they are categoremata. And if something is said without combination, it's of course not a true sentence or false sentence. So it only becomes a true or false sentence when something is predicated of something else. So in On Interpretation, he will discuss the so-called statement-making sentences. And these statements making sentences consist of a subject and a predicate, or a predicate that is said of a subject. In any case, so it's always about onoma and rema, so the relation of an onoma and an rema. So similar discussion we already find in Plato's Sophist. And in whatever way we may translate onoma and rema, it is important to realize that their relation is that of a subject. So Aristotle talks about hypokeimenon on interpretation to a predicate. And in itself, the predicate is something said without combination, so the categories. And in a statement-making sentence, it becomes a sign of things said of something else. So, and just to illustrate how important this theory of predication was for the Stoics, I quote a recent article by Susan Bobsin and Simon Shogri, so this is 2.6. And they say, quote, "The Stoics find themselves in a long philosophical tradition that takes it as given that the subject-predicate distinction provides the basic components of sentences, with the subject expression generally in the nominative. By introducing, and this is now something they claim that is new in Stoicism, is interesting, so they see a development, excuse me. By introducing the secondary event predicates as a kind of monadic predicate and labeling it secondary, the Stoics increase the scope of what is logically treatable. So, but I'm more interested in the first part of the quote, so just that we see that the continuity becomes clear from Plato's Sophist, Aristotle's categories on interpretation, and the Stoic theory of predication. And basically what the Stoics will say about lekta is that we have lekta that are complete and lekta that are not complete. And lekta that are not complete are just simple predicates, so just as we find in Aristotle's categories, but complete lekta are propositions. So complete lekta are basically so a predication where we have an onoma and an rema. So this is more or less the context of the Stoic discussion of lekta. So now we turn to the Neoplatonic criticism. And yeah, I didn't find much material on lekta in Neoplatonism. So maybe some of you in the discussion has some suggestions where to look. But I found only a few passages. And I will start with Plutarch. And Plutarch basically raises a concern that is raised by other authors as well. So Plutarch basically says that, well, the incorporeals are strange entities because they do not exist. And this is an argument we find in Alexander, we find in Sextus Empiricus, we find in Philo of Alexandria, Seneca, in Plotinus, but also in Proclus. And so it's a little bit, how do you say, I think it's not completely correct to say that the incorporeals do not exist. So what we can say is that in Stoicism, only bodies exist in the full sense of the word. But the Stoics have a terminological distinction, and they say, well, bodies exist while incorporeals subsist. So if we say, well, incorporeals do not exist, it's a kind of qualified, I would say, non-existence. It's not an unqualified existence where you can say that, well, incorporeals are nothing at all, but incorporeals subsist. Nevertheless, in the tradition that I just mentioned, so Alexander, Sextus, Philo of Alexandria, and so on, so especially in polemical discussions of the Stoic theory, people just say, well, incorporeals do not exist. And this sometimes causes some confusion, especially in Seneca, but also in other authors. So, for example, Plotinus would say in 6.1, so basically, well, I have to explain a little bit. So there is a Stoic theory of categories, and the Stoics say that the highest genus is T, and T, so the genus of something. And so under the genus of something fall bodies that do exist, but also incorporeals, also incorporeals that only subsist. And Plotinus would say, and there I think you see the polemical spirit. He says, well, if we have a highest genus T, and the Stoics group the incorporeals and the things that exist under the genus T, they group things that exist and not exist under the same genus, and that can't be. So there can't be a genus for things that exist and not exist. So just to show you that this kind of criticism is not always to the point, but is of a polemical nature. So next text by Plotinus. This is maybe not such a surprise for you. So Plotinus is describing intellect in 5.5. And he talks about the contents of intellect. So what is the contents of intellect? He says, well, it's certainly not premises or axioms or expressions. And well, that's, I think, not a surprise. So the way intellect works and thinks is that he thinks in a way that is not discursive. But what I find interesting in this passage, and that's why I quoted it on the handout, is that Plotinus says premises, axioms, and expressions would only say something about other things and would not be the things themselves. I think that's very important. So the ideas are things in themselves, auta ta onta, but lekta are of such a nature that they talk about something else. So they have this referential element, and I think that's important here. So, and the next text is really a classic text, 3.3. So this is Ammonius in the beginning of his commentary on interpretation, where he just claims that lekta are superfluous. And I must say, so for a very long time, I was very much convinced by Ammonius' argument, and I thought, well, really, someone or some Stoic philosopher has to explain to me what the lekta, so what role the lekta really play. But now I think about it in a different way. But let's first have a look at the text. So Ammonius says, and he refers to the first chapter on interpretation, so the passage we have already read together. So he says, here Aristotle tells us what it is that they, so onoma and remata, primarily and immediately signify. His answer is thoughts, but through these, as intermediates, things. And it is not necessary, and this is so the main argument of Ammonius, and it is not necessary to conceive of anything else additional to them, immediate between the thought and the thing, which the Stoics postulated and decided to name sayable. No? Lekton. No? So in other words, lecta are superfluous. We have a theory of signification in Aristotle, and we don't really see what the role of these lecta as intermediates between things and thought could be. The next texts are basically about the nature of lecta. So several authors repeat Ammonius' point, and then the question is always how good was the knowledge of Stoicism of these Neoplatonists, no? And so that there was a problem to find original sources of Stoic philosophers is illustrated by a passage from Simplicius' commentary on the categories. No? So this is text 3.4. And we know that Simplicius was a very careful reader. And for example, when he treats the pre-Socratics, he always tries to find original text and so on. But he complains that, well, he says basically, so there is an extensive treatment of such matters, that is of the Aristotelian categories of poiema and Parthenian, among the Stoics, whose teaching and the majority of whose writings have been unavailable in our time. So I think this is a very interesting document. So we have to really ask ourselves how good these Neoplatonists knew the Stoics. So, and the next texts are basically about the nature of lekta. And this is a problem that is discussed also nowadays in the scholarly literature. So if we go for a moment to 4.1, text 4.1, so some preliminary questions. When you look at the second question, though, what kind of item are lecta? And there are basically three options today in the secondary literature. So we have an ontological interpretation that was first suggested by Michael Frede and is then defended by his pupil Ada Bronowski. So they claim that lecta are basically part of reality. So then we have Vanessa de Haven in her, that I already mentioned, the 2025 monograph. And she tries to demonstrate in great detail that lecta are actually mind dependent. So it's very interesting. And it seems to be a position that, well, was probably first suggested by Anthony Long, but here I'm not sure. While I think, well, part of Michele Alexandrelli's interpretation is that, well, he connects lecta to the divine logos. This is a problem of its own, but then he says that they are certainly linguistic items. So he says that, well, let's say the seed of the lecta is language. So this is a discussion, and a similar discussion in a way we find in antiquity. And we find two texts by Simplicius. And in the first text, 3.5, he equates lekta and thoughts. And this we also find in other authors. So there may be a suggestion that Neoplatonists partly interpreted lekta as thoughts. And this would be more or less, I would say, the reading of De Haven. But the second text is more interesting. And this comes later on. So as you see, the first text, 3.5, is from the preface of the commentary to the categories. But the next text is, towards the end. And there, Simplicius seems to suggest another reading. And he says, well, I will briefly read the text. He says, whether indeed statements consist in words or in the corresponding thoughts or in the corporeal sayables, lekta, which subsist as an appendage. That's his way of translating parhyphistamenos. These statements differ from qualified bodies. So, and I think here Simplicius gives three options. So he doesn't identify lekta with thoughts, but he says, well, either we have expressions, or we have thoughts, or we have lekta. So it seems that here lekta are somehow well, something in between, so something we already saw in Ammonius' text. And the crucial question is, of course, how do we have to understand this parhyphista menois? No? So in some texts we find parhyphistamai, in some texts we find hyphistamai. And it seems that lekta are something that is somehow related to thought in this sense of hyphistamai, parhyphistamai, but it's not clear whether we can really identify lekta with thoughts or whether they are mind dependent. So far the Neoplatonic criticism. And so what I want to show now, so now I will mainly talk about the Stoic theory of lekta, but I want to show that the Neoplatonic criticism can basically be motivated because the Neoplatonists start from a different framework of signification. And this framework is Aristotelian, is the first chapter of De Interpretatione, but that the Stoics have a different theory of signification. And so in other words, it seems to me that the Neoplatonic criticism somehow misses the mark. So we start with these preliminary questions in 4.1. So the first question is, of course, what are lekta, or how are they characterized? And then, what about the being of lekta? No? As I said, well, the discussion, are they ontological, mental, or linguistic? And then another problem, how can lekta be known? So why is this a problem? This is a problem in Stoicism because lekta are not bodies. And as we will see a little bit later, for the Stoics, only bodies are true causes. And only bodies can cause impressions in our soul. So, and since the incorporeals, so the lekta are incorporeal, they can't, strictly speaking, cause these impressions. No? So we also have to ask ourselves, well, how can these lekta be known? And then, this is a little bit the different frameworks I was talking about. So what are the differences between Aristotle's and the Stoics' theory of signification? And I think this is really an essential point for so the whole discussion, and also for understanding better the Neoplatonic criticism. And then finally, and this is some tentative suggestions, so what may be the benefits of introducing lekta? So we start with a characterization, and here I have only collected ways Stoics talk about lekta, and I will illustrate this later by means of different texts. So the Stoics say that lekta are incorporeal. And lekta are not the only incorporeals in Stoicism. Also time, place, and void are incorporeal. Then, I've already said, so while bodies exist, lekta only subsist. And the words I used are hyphistanai or parhyphistanai. So, and they subsist according to thought. So, as I said, they are somehow related to thought, but it's not clear in what way. So then there's one text very difficult in Diogenes Laertius, where he says that lecture actually consists of several fantasiae, so ek fantasion. So, and this is, for example, a text where Vanessa de Haven would say, well, this may show that lecta are somehow mind dependent. So then Stoics call the lecta significations or meanings, but also pragmata. So this is very interesting. Usually pragmata can refer to things, or sometimes also to Platonic ideas in Neoplatonic texts. But the Stoics would call the lecta pragmata. And this was one reason why, for instance, Michael Frege argued that they are ontological entities. So, and then the Stoics say the lecta are effects of causes, and then they are predicates or propositions. So I already talked about this distinction between complete lecta and lecta that are not complete. And then they are even objects of striving. So this regards ethics. And according to Victor Kasten, lecta take over some of the tasks of Platonic forms. So there, the discussion is basically, well, what about the status of universals, and what can be the place of universals in Stoic philosophy? And well, what we can say is that the term lecton seems to have been introduced by Cleanthes, so not by Zeno himself. But from the characterization of lecta, you can see, well, they seem to have so many tasks and so many different characterizations that it seems rather difficult to find a kind of unified theory of lecta. So in the following 4.1.2, so I give 5 features of lecta. And I think these are domains where we can find lecta. So the first is causality. So the Stoic theory of causality. And there lecta are said to be effects of causes. So causes, that means bodies, or causal relations between bodies. So then, of course, language. They say that lecta are significations or meanings in between what signifies and the thing it refers to. So, and while the latter two are bodies, so the things that signify and the things that are referred to, the lecta are incorporeal. Then this was already mentioned, so lecta are predicates and propositions. And yeah, what we can say that, well, complete lecta, so the Stoics give many examples of complete lecta, and some of them are propositions, but others at least have some kind of propositional content. So then truth, we already saw that according to Aristotle, truth is located in the mind. But interestingly, the Stoics would say that lecta, but only as complete lecta, are bearers of truth and falsehood. And so with a text from Sextus, so truth is situated in the sphere of what is true and false to be the signification, to seminomenon. So then they are objects of reference, or propositional content of thought and speech. and this refers to written and spoken speech. And I think that may probably be the reason why they are called pragmata, according to some sources. And then finally, in ethics, they are objects of impulse or striving. So, and I now try to illustrate these different uses the Stoics make of the lekta. But I want to start with a very general claim the Stoics make. And this is in 4.2. And this is a claim about the parts of philosophy. So, as you know, in Stoicism, we have three parts of philosophy. We have logic, we have ethics, and we have physics. And the Stoics say that you can't really separate these parts; they belong together. And if you look at the second text on the handout 4.2, they say, so no single part of philosophy is independent of any other part, but all blend together. Nor was it usual to teach them separately. And I think this is crucial for an understanding of lekta, because, well, lekta, as we have seen above, seem indeed to relate to all three domains of philosophy. So to ethics as objects of striving, to physics as causes, and of course to logic regarding truth and falsehood and language. So then we turn to 4.3. So all causes are corporeal. So this is a famous Stoic dictum. So there's a passage from Cicero. And what is important is the end, where he says that only a body is capable of acting or of being acted upon. So, and I think, or what I want to suggest here is that this peculiar theory of causality that we find in Stoicism poses an epistemological dilemma. So this is the next text, and I formulated the dilemma as follows. So the Stoic view seems to imply that we perceive bodies because, as causes, they leave imprints or impressions on our hegemonikon. So bodies as causes can leave these impressions. However, what about the causal relations between these, let's call them monadic bodies, or activities of their bodies? So there we have two examples. So they are called energeiae, these activities, or praxes. So how can we perceive these relations or these activities? For relations or activities do not necessarily seem to be corporeal. So, and that these activities are not necessarily corporeal is illustrated, for example, in the next text from Seneca. So this is letter 117. So Seneca's letters are always a little bit difficult for reconstructing the Stoic theory, because we don't really know how much Seneca knew about Stoicism. And certainly what we find in Seneca is a kind of let's say, a mixture between Stoic elements and Platonic elements. But once in a while, he quotes, or he talks about philosophical topics that are genuinely Stoic. And one example is, this letter 117, where he talks about lekta. And I will only read the second part to you. So when I say Cato walks, so this is line 5, Cato walks, he says, what I'm now saying is not a body, but something expressible about the body. And some people call this, and now you find, this is very interesting, different Latin translations for lekton. Some people call this effatum. Others call it enunciatum. Still others call it dictum. Thus, when we say wisdom, we understand something which is bodily, so let's say the hegemonikon in a particular state, but when we say is wise, we are talking about a body. No? So it's really about, let's say, nominating a body and talking about bodies. And it makes an enormous difference whether you mention the person or talk about the person. So in other words, Cato walks, we have a body, Cato, and this Cato has a certain activity, namely walking. And this is here where the lekton comes in. So then, so the epistemological dilemma was, so how can we describe the relations between bodies if these relations are not corporeal? So there's an interesting text from Sextus Empiricus, and there are also other parallel texts. And Sextus says it's very, very striking. So the Stoics say that every cause, aition, is a body that becomes the cause to a body of something incorporeal. For instance, so and here's the example of the knife. The knife, a body, becomes the cause to the flesh, a body, of the incorporeal predicate, asomaton kategorema, being cut. And again, fire, a body, becomes the cause to the wood, a body, of the incorporeal predicate being burned. So we see that somehow the interrelation of bodies or the causal effects that bodies can have on one another is described by means of lekta. And so here I would like you to look at the figure that I put on the handout under 4.5. So this is a figure I took from an article by a scholar called Tocznik, published in 2013. And it's what he calls the Stoic square of causation. And there I think we can see very well how this works. So we have the knife, and the knife is cutting, and the flesh is being cut. And now the interesting thing is, and so he's referring to a text of Clement of Alexandria in this respect, that both the knife can be said to be cause to the flesh, but also the flesh can be said to be cause to the knife. And Tocznik says, well, this causation does not seem to be directional. So usually we think of causation as being directional, but he says, well, in Stoicism, it's probably not directional. And he explains this as follows. So this is the quote from Tocznik, just above the figure. So sayables are thus effects of the activity of bodies. They are the facts or events produced by the interactions of the bodies that make up the world. These facts or events are what is sayable or expressible, what can be said about the world. They constitute the domain of meaning. And this domain is for the Stoics something incorporeal, something over and above corporeal reality. So we have this peculiar theory of causation. So, and now briefly, let's come back to where we have left the handout before, so 4.3.5. And this is the text from Ethics, and where it is said that we desire predicates, or we can say we desire certain activities. So it says that choices and desires and wishes, just like impulses, are of predicates. Yet we choose and wish and likewise desire to have goods. And so goods are choice-worthy and wish-worthy and desirable. For we choose to have prudence and moderation, but not, of course, to have acting prudently and acting moderately. which are incorporeal predicates. So, and this reminds us also of Seneca, who made this distinction between wisdom and being wise. So then I will come to the next epistemological dilemma. So how can we conceptualize these lekta? And this is really an interesting problem, and it's discussed in great detail in Sextus Adversus Mathematicus. And I will just read the text 4.4.2. So it's the famous drill sergeant text. So maybe you have heard of it before. So Sextus says, for they, the Stoics, say, just as the trainer or drill sergeant sometimes takes hold of the body's hand to drill him and to teach him to make certain motions, but sometimes stands at a distance and moves to a certain drill to provide himself as a model for the boy. So too, some impressors, so with impressors, Sextus means things that cause impressions in our soul. So some impressors touch, as it were, and make contact with the commanding faculty to make their printing in it, as do the colors white and black and body in general. Whereas others have a nature like that of the incorporeal sayables. So in a certain sense, we can say incorporeal sayables are impressors, but they can't make this bodily contact. So they can't literally make an imprint in our soul. And now the way the Greek is phrased is a little bit complicated. So I translated it in the following way. And images present themselves to the commanding faculty, tu hegemoniku phantasio menu. And so there's a discussion in the scholarly literature whether this is middle or passive. So Vanessa de Haven argues that it's middle because she wants to, or she claims that it's our fantasia that somehow brings forth these images. So I don't think so, but this is a difficult discussion. And anyway, images present themselves to the commanding faculty. And now here it's important to look at the prepositions. Over and above them, eb autois, not by them or through their direct agency, hyp autois. So we have the preposition hyp or hypo for this direct impression, this bodily contact. And then we have eb autois. And eb autois, yeah, it's really difficult to understand. So what may be the force of this preposition? So some people have suggested that it's a kind of abstraction that it's going on here, and it is interesting. Already in Plato's Parmenides, the universal is characterized as a hen epipolois. So there is something that relates this epi to theory of universals, abstraction, and so on. But it's difficult to say what is going on. Anyway, we have two texts that tell us explicitly how these lekta are conceptualized. So, and this is text 4.4.4. It's from Diogenes, and then the next text from Sextus. And Diogenes says very clearly, some things are also conceived by transition, metabasis, such as place and sayables. So in a way, so since place is also a lekton, we can probably infer that all lekta are conceived by metabasis. In any case, it's this method or notion of metabasis. And the question is, well, what can that mean? So Sextus is more explicit about it. And he says, well, the dogmatists say that it is not uttered speech, but internal speech by which man differs from the non-rational animals. For crows, parrots, and jays utter articulate sounds. Nor is it by the merely simple impression that they differ, for they too receive impressions. And this is interesting, they receive impressions. So I haven't put the word here, but it's the same word, these fantasiustae. So the animals receive impressions. And that's what, well, this passage is also part of the argument why I think it should be passive, because it's difficult to imagine that these animals just would for themselves create these impressions. No? In any way, so the animals too receive impressions. But, and here comes something that is characteristic for the metabasis, but by impressions produced by inference and combination. So, and here we have a different notion of fantasia. So in general, it's very difficult to translate fantasia in Stoicism. But here Sextus is talking about a fantasia metabatikae kai syntheticae. So a kind of fantasia that is responsible for metabasis and for putting things together. And what is interesting in the next sentence, he would link this kind of fantasia to logic or making inferences. So this amounts to his possessing, the human being possessing the conception of following, akolotias enoia, and directly grasping, on account of following, the idea of sign. For sign is itself of the kind, if this, then that. No? So we see human beings can conceptualize lekta because they have a certain fantasia in their soul, which is called fantasia metabatikae and syntheticae. And this fantasia also allows human beings to make syllogisms and so on. Okay, now I go to 4.6. So, and this is now the different epistemological frameworks I was talking about earlier on. So I think in Aristotle and the Stoics, we have both different epistemological frameworks, but we have also different theories of signification. And so under 4.6.1, there are two quotations by Gräser and Gaskin. So Gräser says, in the De Interpretatione, the relation between his noemata, acts of thought, which Aristotle elsewhere distinguishes from mental images, and the things of which they are likenesses, is one of copy to original. So we have seen that. And Gaskin says, so Gaskin actually compares Aristotle and the Stoics, and he says, well, for Aristotle, the distinction to be applied is as follows. The senses of linguistic items are affections in the soul, which we may identify with thoughts. And the reference are things in the world, including, as we have seen, states of affairs. Such as such a sentence, so I believe this is not so important, Socrates is sitting. For the Stoics, the senses of linguistic items are sayables, lekta, also called pragmata by the Stoics, and the reference are again things in the world. So we can see, so there's a different framework of signification. So what is even more important, and this you find under 4.6.2, are other fundamental differences between the Stoics and Aristotle regarding psychology, ontology, and epistemology. So first, psychology. for the Stoics, scientific knowledge is the commanding faculty disposed in a certain way, just as a fist is the hand disposed in a certain way. And the commanding faculty is a body. And whereas for Aristotle, probably, yeah, noemata are immaterial. Okay, so ontology for the Stoics, all things in our world are unique individuals, idios poia. So the Stoics would say that there is not one grain of sand that resembles another grain of sand. No? And these unique individuals do not possess any universal elements or traits. And well, probably regarding universals, the Stoics are nominalists. No? So in Aristotle, one may argue that, well, there are universal elements, at least potentially, in things, and we can abstract them and so on. So this in Stoicism doesn't seem possible. So, and then something we have already talked about. So for Aristotle, truth is located in the mind. But for the Stoics, what is true and false is located in the to seminomenon, the signification. And the signification is incorporeal, the state of affairs signified and sayable. So here you have an example of the use of pragma, to seminomenon pragma kai lekton, which is true or false. So, and then finally, and this is, I think, also very important for the Stoics, language is not by convention, it is by nature. And on this assumption, I think also the Stoic theory of etymology is based. So when the Stoics talk about language, it's only the Greek language. Whereas, well, in Aristotle, I think, well, this first chapter of on interpretation, that fits for different languages. And Aristotle, as we read, says that language is by convention, so not by nature. So I conclude with 4 suggestions why the Stoics introduced lekta. And most of them have already been suggested by Dorothea Frede. And one suggestion I take from Gurinard. Although I must say that, well, so the first point, this is probably not so clear in Frege. So the first point would be, and this is, let's say, if you remember the epistemological dilemma, so only bodies can make impressions on our soul, but how can we describe activities or relations between bodies? And I think this is why the Stoics basically introduced the lekta. And well, Frede already said something like this. She said, well, without incorporeal sayables, the Stoics would be left with a rather crude ontology. So I think it would be an ontology of monadic bodies that do not really stand in a relation to each other. So second point, so lekta allow us to talk about what is not and about past and future. So remember, compared to Aristotle, Chrysippus had this strange theory. So this principle of bivalence, either an assertion is true or it is false. And this holds also true when we talk about the future. So the problem Aristotle raises in the 9th chapter of De Interpretatione. And for Chrysippus, you can say that when you talk about the future, the things are either true or false. Then third option, so third possibility, why lekta are introduced. So lekta are intendable objects, and they allow for meaningful exchange and intersubjectivity. And then finally, and this is, I think, a very interesting suggestion by Gurinard in an article from 2018. So here I will go immediately to the quote from Marcus Aurelius. So Marcus Aurelius says, do not say more to yourself than what the initial impression declares. They have told you that someone speaks evil of you. That's what it has, that is what it has told you. But that you are injured, this has not been told to you. So I take it that what Gurina wants to suggest is that ethics is also about decoding impressions. When you have an impression and it says, okay, someone talks bad about you, or then can you say, okay, it doesn't, so I'm not injured, and so on. So this is, I think, a very interesting suggestion. Okay, to conclude, Neoplatonic criticism of lekta presupposes a framework of reference and signification that is not genuinely Stoic, but departs from what Aristotle says in the first chapter of On Interpretation. There seems to be evidence that lekta were first introduced to deal with an epistemological dilemma of how relations between monadic bodies could best be described. So this is an idea that already Frede had. So Frede said, so maybe it originated in the Stoic theory of causality. So the theory as such seems to be one of our earliest reflections on a theory of signification, independent from the activity of the mind, i.e. a theory of signification. So here I mean the theory that we find in Aristotle, a theory of signification based on thoughts and their contents. And such a theory of signification, so that we find in Aristotle, is sometimes referred to by scholars as a so-called mentalistic semantics. So thank you very much.